Anyway, today's lecture, like I said, we're going to talk about the history of World War II from 1942, of course, to the end of the conflict. So yeah, this might be a little longer lecture, but I do need to talk about what happens in Europe up to 1945. And also in the Pacific, we'll talk a lot about the Americans, how the Americans defeat the Japanese, of course, in the Pacific. Anyway, up to that point, we were talking about how the United States had entered, World War II, because I think we had talked about how the Japanese had, pretty much attacked Pearl Harbor, and that's really what got, the United States into the war. However, there's like these turning point battles that they always talk about in World War II. 1942, was the turning point year of World War II. It's basically, you've got all these big battles that, of course, occur that are kind of famous. Like the Battle of Alamein and, of course, the Battle of Stalingrad. Those are usually considered the two big battles that were really kind of the big turning points in the war. Later, I'll talk about the Battle of Midway. That was another one. They had all these different battles that helped turn the war in the Allies' favor. 1942-43, usually roughly, is when they are. These are the three battles again, and when they took place. The battles of Alamein, especially the second one, that one in July, but the one in October 1942 is usually considered the one that's more important. Battle of Stalingrad, which took place over quite a long time, 6 months or so, August 42 to February 1943, which was on the Eastern Front. El Alamein was in North Africa, of course. Battle of Midway was, of course, in the Pacific in June 1942. So had all these different campaigns that were kind of going on, which the first one I'll kind of talk about, I'll kind of spend a little time talking about Erwin Rommel, who you may have heard of, who is known as the Desert Fox. You might have heard of him. He's a very famous German general in World War II. Some people think he was one of the best generals, maybe, that was on the German side in the war. And what happened was in 1940 to 43, there was a deal where Hitler tried to take over North Africa because Hitler wanted control of Egypt and the Suez Canal. If he could control that area, that would really help turn the war. And maybe they could control a lot of the oil fields that are in the east. And so he sent this general there, you can see, which was Erwin Rommel. And he had this military unit that was called the Afrika Korps. The Afrika Korps was like a German-Italian army that was mostly, they used like tanks and trucks. It was kind of very mechanized, basically. And Rommel got the nickname Desert Fox because he was kind of a genius at warfare in the desert. The Afrika Korps was able to take control of Libya, and then they started pushing eastward into Egypt. And that's when they, it led to those strategic battles I told you about, which were El Alamein. He was opposed by this other general who became very famous in World War II in North Africa, which was Bernard Montgomery, who had different nicknames you can see there, like Monty. Some people called him the Spartan General as well. And Montgomery's forces were pivotal in defeating really in that strategic battle we're talking about, which is the Second Battle of El Alamein, which took place, by the way, over a period of like 2-3 weeks. El Alamein was this village or city which was in the northwestern part of Egypt. It's very important. It's like a port city and vital rail junction that was there. And if Rommel could have taken it, he could have then marched on and taken Cairo, probably the Suez Canal. But Rommel's forces were heavily outnumbered. We actually, in fact, the United States, because of the Lend-Lease Act, had been able to get a lot of tanks over to help out what was the so-called British, they call it the British Eighth Army, is what basically Rommel was up against. So he was opposed by the Eighth Army. And they basically beat him bad. Rommel's forces was beaten. Actually, Rommel wasn't even at the battle. He was actually ill with some kind of stomach illness. He had to fly back to Germany. But his forces were outnumbered. And so what ended up happening was Rommel's forces, they got routed back into Libya, and then they got even eventually got pushed all the way back into, at one point, Algeria and Tunisia. So that was really considered to be a very important battle in the war. And I think there's kind of a map showing this Al Alamein. You can see it was like right by the Libyan-Egyptian border. So from there, they were to push them westward, basically back again at that point. And so that's kind of pivotal, and one of the things that really, is really a changing thing in the war. I think there was a famous quote, by the way, I did want to mention, and I don't think you have to know about this, but I believe it was Churchill that said famously that before Al Alamein, we never had a victory. And then he said afterwards that after Alamein, we never had a defeat. And it was pretty much true with the British and the Allies. Pretty much after Al Alamein, the Allies started winning. They also had what is called Operation Torch, which I'll kind of mention also a little bit about as well. That was the Allied invasion of North Africa, like French controlled North Africa by American forces. That was really our first taste of really fighting the Germans, I guess, in the war. Although we really fought the Vichy French that controlled it, who were allies of the Germans. And we landed forces under Patton and also Dwight D. Eisenhower. Both were the main commanders of the forces. And we seized Morocco, Algeria, mostly those areas. And you can see there were the city of Casablanca. You can see Oran, Algiers, those cities. And the French switched to the Allied side because they realized that the Germans, basically were losing the war. These are the two generals, by the way, of course, in that conflict, that Operation Torch. Of course, Ike, or Eisenhower, led D-Day later. Eisenhower was later president of the United States, if you know about the 1950s. And then George S. Patton, they called him Old Blood and Guts. He later was famous for his so-called Third Army that fought in Europe later. Patton was probably considered one of the greatest generals on the American side in the war, although he's controversial, if you know about that. He kind of had bad language, and he was known for slapping around soldiers that he had thought were very good. So now what happened eventually, because of Operation Torch and because of Rommel's defeats in the war, eventually Rommel's forces were forced to surrender in Tunisia. They were just surrounded by the Americans and the British that were basically coming from east from west across North Africa. And so about 300,000 of their troops were actually captured at one point. And so Rommel was forced to basically fly back to Germany. He left his troops behind, and Hitler put Rommel in charge of what they call the Atlantic Wall, you may have heard of, which was this fortification that they were trying to build in Western Europe to prevent like an Allied invasion. So, which didn't really work, but that's basically some of the first taste of fighting the Germans in North Africa right there. Now, the other big battle they always talk about, which was important, that I need to go back and talk about, that you may have heard about, is, of course, the famous Battle of Stalingrad, which was fought, I told you, between the dates for it were August about 1942 in February of 1943. And it was part of a second operation by Hitler to basically seize more territory in the Soviet Union. I think they called it Operation Blue or something like that. That's what they called it. But it was part of a second offensive by Hitler where they were trying to concentrate more on the southwestern part of Russia, where they had oil fields. Baku, I think, is where they talk about sometimes. And they wanted to take over Stalingrad, which was a famous city that was industrialized, but it was named after Stalin. And also it was important because it was on the Volga River, which is an important river in part of central Russia. And so what happened was Stalingrad became one of the most important battles, really, in the whole war. It is considered, by the way, one of the bloodiest in history. Close to 1.5 million people were killed and wounded in it, which is probably more than some other battles we talked about, like Battle of Verdun or Battle of the Somme, which was in World War I. You can see it lasted close to 200 days. Ridiculous, the amount. And what happened was the main German force there, which I believe was the German 6th Army, it got surrounded by the Soviet forces who counterattacked in the winter. And it ended up becoming a major turning point in the war. And what happened was the Germans really never recovered from it. They lost a lot of, men and material, fighting on the Eastern Front. And so after that, the Germans basically, they didn't win too many battles, after 1942. And they get this vast retreat, where the Germans begin retreating on the Eastern Front back to Germany. The Soviets end up driving through Germany and like Poland and Hungary as they basically invade Eastern Europe. That'll later help to lead to the collapse, of course, of the so-called Soviet Union. Then they had other campaigns I did want to mention, like, of course, one of the big things that, of course, happened next. They had Operation Husky, which, of course, led to the invasion of Italy. That's the next thing that really happened next, if you know about this. And Winston Churchill had this idea that maybe they could defeat Nazi Germany by attacking through Italy, the so-called underbelly, of Nazi Germany. Which proved to be kind of wrong because, as we'll see later. And the Italian campaign was really bloody. I think they had somewhere between, I don't know if it was that many people. It was 1 to 2 million casualties I know they had in that campaign combined on both sides in the war. But it would result on a campaign that would last really longer than they thought it would, close to about almost 2 years that it did. And it started with Operation Husky. You can see Husky was this campaign where the Allies invaded Sicily from their bases in North Africa. And it involved predominantly the British and American forces, which were led again by Patton, and mostly Patton, and of course also Montgomery, who was involved in it. And Operation Husky, eventually, it basically forced the Italian and Germans to retreat from basically Sicily to what is the mainland, southern Italy. And at this point, Benito Mussolini was very embarrassed by this. He thought they could stop the Allies from, taking part of Italy, but they couldn't. And so the king of Italy wasn't impressed with that. And so Mussolini was forced to basically resign from power. So you get this next thing where basically Mussolini, falls from power in 1943. He steps down. And so at that point, the government decides that they've had enough of being part of the Axis powers, which is true about that. And so if you know what happened, the Italians actually switched to the Allied side. That's one of the things that they, of course, did. But Hitler refused to give up. Hitler basically took over Italy's its defenses. They didn't want to, abandon Italy because then the Allies would just march up through Italy and Austria and invade Germany from the south, like Churchill thought they would, basically. And so it was a continued conflict, the Italian campaign, which would last a long time because of that. The Italian campaign was kind of a weird conflict because it was composed of all these different nationalities from all over the world, from Canada, India, and so on. And it was because of the fact that a lot of the main forces of the British and Americans were starting to train to invade France, like the so-called DDay Invasion that would follow later. And so they had troops from all over the place. They even had like Japanese American forces that fought, and there were African American troops that actually fought in Italy, one of the very few that actually participated, in actual combat, which is true about that war as well. They fought against this general, by the way, whose name was Albert Kesselring. They called him Smiling Albert. He was actually a Luftwaffe general, but he was actually a pretty good general in the war. what Kesselring did, he set up defense lines along Italy's terrain, which was mostly mountainous, if you know about that. And so the advance up the actual Italian peninsula was very slow. They had trouble trying to take each mountain and all that. And so that's why it dragged on forever, the Italian campaign. And a lot of times the Italian campaign was sometimes called the so-called Forgotten War, because they were fighting in Europe later, and most people forgot they were fighting down there still over many, many months. The most famous battles they fought, by the way, I don't think you really have to know these, but the battles of Anzio and probably Monte Cassino were probably the most instrumental battles they always talk about, because they were important Allied victories, which led to the fall of Rome, which Rome fell on June 4th, 1944. And the fall of Rome was actually the first Axis capital that actually fell to the Allies. But like I said, it would actually take a long time for the Allies to basically take Italy back up to, like, I want to say May of 1945. They were just getting up into the northern part of Italy. They still hadn't conquered the whole thing. By the way, Mussolini was later captured by partisans at the end of the war. And if you know what happened to him, they shot him. It was famous. And then they hung him by his toes or his feet or whatever, as you see there. That's him with, I think, one of his mistresses that they shot too with him. Then they had the D-Day invasion that they had as well that followed Normandy, of course, 1944. Of course, one of the most famous events that the United States, of course, is involved in. And, of course, what happened was with D-Day, the Allies, were planning to invade, and set up a second front in Europe. And so the D-Day invasion, also usually called either Operation Overlord or also called the Battle of Normandy, either one of those, was the invasion of occupied France, which, the Germans had occupied pretty much France since 1940. And so this was a massive operation, which, by the way, would eventually involve 2 million men. They would eventually cross the English Channel from Britain and invade. And the forces that were involved in D-Day were like a mix of different forces. They had, of course, predominantly American and British were the main forces that fought in France. I would say they made up the majority of the forces. The United States made up, I want to say, almost 2/3, maybe like 60% of the actual forces that invaded. Also, Canada put up forces. You can see the Free French and also some Polish forces I told you about before. May have mentioned about that. Also participated as well. The initial invasion had about 160,000 soldiers that crossed over initially in the first amphibious invasion, but 2 million will get across eventually into France and invade. It was one of the largest invasions in history. I think if you look at stats about the actual invasion, which I've got right here, there's all kinds of stats on it, which is well known. But you can see here that it had as many as like 5,000 ships involved. 13,000 aircraft were also involved. So it was a massive invasion. The largest, by the way, amphibious invasion in history. You can see almost 10,000 men were killed on the first day. But, of course, it would enable men to cross over. The actual AEF, which is called the Allied Expeditionary Forces, by the way, commanded by Dwight Eisenhower. He's an American commander, of course, involved with the forces. And, of course, the famous date was June 6, 1944. It was actually supposed to have on June 5th. 5th is when it was supposed to actually invade. Because of bad weather, they had to postpone it one day. They sometimes talk about Operation Bodyguard. I did want to mention about that. Bodyguard was this Allied operation that was kind of secretive. It was a deception plan to basically trick the Germans on where the D-Day invasion would come. They didn't want the Germans to figure out that Normandy was the location. Otherwise, they could have concentrated their forces, pushed them back in the sea. And so they created these fake landing locations throughout Europe and other places. They also created fake invasion armies too. Like one of the most famous was basically the first U.S. Army group, which was a bogus American army that was placed at Calais, across from where basically where Dover, it actually was put at Dover where Calais is, right across. And it was led by George S. Patton. So the Germans all thought that it was a real army. And so that was a way that they tricked basically the Germans into not knowing, where the invasion would actually come across. So I think if they would have figured it out, that would have been a big problem. Here's the actual invasion route, of course, that they took. The Allies, which they crossed and landed. You can see here that they brought in American, British, and other forces through amphibious landings. And there are 5 main landing beaches that the Allies landed at. They had, of course, Omaha and Utah beaches, of course, where the American sectors were. And the British and Canadians came across and landed at Gold, Sword, and Juno sectors. So you can see those right there. They also had airborne units. You can kind of see that too. But the British and Americans had airborne units that were basically involved, that came in. They were dropped in to basically seize control of like important crossroads or bridges that they would need to take in the interior. Cherbourg, I think, and Caen were like their main objectives, cities that they wanted to seize. Now, by the way, if one of the things that's very important about D-Day I did want to mention about is the fact that they had this man named Andrew Higgins. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was from Louisiana, from New Orleans. And Higgins is important in the invasion. He was, of course, the one that developed a lot of the so-called Higgins boats that were used, these so-called LCVP landing craft that you're looking at in that picture right there. And these were landing craft that originally were designed to be used in Louisiana. Like on the southern coast of Louisiana, we have a lot of marshes and swamps. And so that's why it was mostly used. And Hitler was so impressed by this, by the way, he thought that was part of why the Allies won the war. And he called him New Noah, like from the book of Genesis. And so that was kind of instrumental in why a lot of these amphibious battles, not just here, but in the Pacific, worked out because of what Andrew Jackson Higgins, of course, did. Now, after D-Day, by the way, they had the Battle of Normandy that would take place between June and August. Those were instrumental in seizing control of Cherbourg and Caen, I told you about. And there's an important strategic battle that's well known in D-Day, which I did want to show you. That's kind of important. But they had the so-called Battle of the Falaise Pocket, they called it, or I think also some people dub it the Battle of Falaise Gap. And this was a strategic battle where most of Hitler's forces that were kind of to the west of Paris got almost wiped out in a offensive. And mostly British American forces were instrumental in encircling their forces. But they call it sometimes gap because some of them were able to escape, if you know about that. But they're kind of instrumental because it led to the fall of Paris eventually, because Paris would fall a few days later on August the 24th, 1944. And really, Normandy was really the Americans' most bloodiest battle in the whole war. We had something like 226,000 casualties in World War II. The other two battles that were pretty bloody were the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Okinawa, which were later. Now, from there, what happened after Paris fell, the Germans started retreating eastward. And so they're going to start being pushed back into Belgium. Eventually, the Allies will push them, of course, back into Germany, across the Rhine by the spring of 1945. Meanwhile, they had this other thing that happened I did want to mention about Adolf Hitler that's kind of famous about the end of World War II. They had this thing called Operation Valkyrie, if you may have heard of this, where there was an attempted assassination on Adolf Hitler. Happened in like July of 1944. And it had different names. They called it Operation Valkyrie, or the other common name they dubbed it was called the 20 July Plot. And it was this conspiracy in the German Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, to basically overthrow Hitler, like kill him off, and then take over the war. And this man named Klaus von Stauffenberg, who was in the German army, he was a colonel. He was one of the men that was a ringleader that was in it, that conspired to basically kill Hitler. And if you know what happened, he went to his headquarters, which was at a place called Rastenburg in East Prussia. It was called the Wolf's Lair by the Germans. And he brought a bomb to the actual meeting with Hitler. He had some kind of briefcase, and he actually had 2 bombs in it, but apparently Stauffenberg was only able to arm one of the 2 bombs. And Stauffenberg was known for being this war hero who had been wounded in the war. And he had trouble because I think he had one hand that had been blown off, and the other one had like 2 or 3 fingers or something like that. So he had trouble trying to actually arm them. He had to use pliers or something like that to actually arm them. And anyway, the bomb went off. And of course, if you know what happened, it failed to kill Hitler. And so Stauffenberg and a bunch of other, like probably hundreds of thousands of people were rounded up for trying to kill Hitler. And they were eventually put to death for it. I think Stauffenberg was shot. Erwin Rommel, by the way, actually knew about the plot. He was implicated in it. And of course, he was later forced to commit suicide, I think with cyanide or something like that. So I don't know what would happen if they would have killed Hitler early. It might have changed the war or something like that, more or less. Hey, Edwina, what's going on? Hey, hope you're having a great morning, by the way, out there as well. So, yeah, that was Operation Valkyrie that they had. So, and apparently it didn't do much. Hitler survived the bombing and it destroyed the room where they were in. They were meeting, but I think it didn't do much to him damage-wise. Let me also talk about this other thing that happened that was also famous, of course, at the end of World War II in Europe. They had the Battle of Bulge that happened also next. That was very famous. The Battle of the Bulge was this famous conflict that happened on the Western Front. It was the bloodiest and one of the bloodiest American battles we ever fought in, of course, up there with the Battle of Normandy. It was fought between December 1944 to January of 1945. And what happened was Hitler attempted this massive offensive in the winter in what is the Ardennes forest. He tried to kind of duplicate what happened in May of 1940 when he defeated the Allies in the West. And so he thought that if he could defeat the British and the Americans in the winter of 1940, he could then just face off against the Soviets in the East, because Germany was having to fight 2-front war at this point. And so the Germans called it a nickname. They called it the Operation Watch on the Rhine. That's actually one of the names they called it. The newspapers called it Battle of the Bulge because the fact that in a lot of images it had this huge bulge in the Allied lines that formed, which you can see at the top right there. And they almost broke through. In fact, the Germans were trying to push towards Antwerp, which I think is close to, I guess, the English Channel, North Sea. And that would have basically driven them in half, and that could have changed the whole outcome of the war in the West. But luckily, the Allies were able to defeat the Germans in that winter conflict right there. There was a famous story you may have heard of where there was a American general named Anthony McAuliffe, who his forces were surrounded in Bastion, which is in part of Belgium today. And the Germans asked him to surrender. It's a very, very, very famous story. And if you know what happened, he basically told them in a famous reply, he said, in quotes, nuts, is what he told them, with exclamation points. I think it was all capitalized too. The Germans didn't know what the hell he meant, nuts. But anyway, the Battle of the Bulge, though, was, like I said, very bloody. A lot of it was because of the fact that it was such a really bad winter that the Americans fought in. Also, it was the terrain was horrible as well. So bad terrain, bad cold weather, close to, I want to say, almost 15, 20,000 may have been killed. I think that's different numbers on it, but I want to think it's almost 19,000 or something like that may have been actually killed at one point. So Battle of the Bulge was, like I said, pretty bloody, but basically after that, the Germans, began retreating pretty much in the west. In fact, the Americans, British, crossed pretty much the Rhine River by March of 1945. And then, of course, in the east, like Eastern Front, the Germans eventually overwhelmed them. The Germans are overwhelmed by the Soviets, who invade through Eastern Europe, basically. And really the last battle of the whole war was the Battle of Berlin, which happened late April, early May of 1945. The Germans tried to kind of fight to the death, if you know about that, in Berlin, but they were just outnumbered, outgunned pretty much. And so, Soviet Union starts taking over Eastern Europe at that point. And so Hitler, they think, killed himself. At least that's the theory about what happened to Adolf Hitler, is that supposedly on April 30th, 1945, he basically killed himself. And he actually made I think one of the head of the Navy, Dönitz, I think his name was, Admiral Dönitz, was made Fuhrer, I think, at one point. But he realized that the war was over at that point. And so what happened on May 8th, 1945, the German Wehrmacht basically began to pretty much surrender to the Allies in Europe. I think pretty much from May 7th to May 9th, I think, is the time period of when they start surrendering. And May 8th is usually seen as the official date of when they surrender, which is now called Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, of course, today. So that pretty much ended the conflict in Europe. And I'll get to it later, but they'll have the Cold War, which will follow, right after, on the heels of that, of course, which will kind of change everything after the war. So-called post-World War II era is kind of different, of course, which U.S. and Soviet Union are the only superpowers left, which will kind of is why the Cold War happens. All right, I'm going to kind of move on. We're going to also talk about the so-called Pacific War that happened next, which Pacific War or campaign, called either one, of course, was a campaign where the United States, had to fight the Japanese from Pearl Harbor up to 1945, because, the Japanese basically overwhelmed part of the Pacific, and part of Eastern Asia. And so it would take a bunch of years for us to fight them also as well. We fought them not quite. I guess we fought them for something like close to about less than 4 years overall. And I'll kind of go through and talk about what were some strategic battles that were kind of important, of course, in the Pacific. One of the first battles that was kind of important, of course, in the Cold War was the Battle of Midway, which happened in June 1942. It was considered one of the major turning points, of course, in World War II. Some people think they did, and I know there's been a talk about that they may have escaped. There's been books written about it, about that, to maybe South America, like submarine or something like that. I've heard all kinds of stories about that, but I don't know if they've ever been really to prove it exactly, but that is an interesting story about that. But Midway was a big turning point, like in the Pacific. Really, the Japanese never recovered from this. And Midway was a series of islands that were in the Central Pacific, where the Japanese were hoping to take that and then maybe seize Hawaii. And so the U.S. Navy fought the Japanese Navy for control of those islands. And what happened was, in the battle, we were heavily outnumbered. I think the American side was outnumbered like 4-1 in the battle. And so we were able to sink like 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers that were actually at Pearl Harbor. In fact, those 4, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, were all sunk in the battle. And so the Japanese were never really able to recover from Midway. they would keep fighting the war, but it was something they never really recovered from, like all the ships that they needed, especially carriers in the war. They lost a lot of pilots too because of Midway. So Midway was considered like a miracle. I think some people nickname it the miracle at Midway because of the fact that we were able to kind of defeat the Japanese right there at that point. Because really, after this is only like maybe 6 months after Pearl Harbor happened that we were able to kind of recover a little bit from that. Also, they had the I want to kind of mention a little bit about the different strategies that of course, Americans used in the Pacific. The Americans used a strategy that's either called island hopping or some people call it leapfrogging. It was this idea to retake the Pacific using American forces, which would be using a lot of the Navy, of course, that would help to ship around Marines and Army forces that would attack various islands and take them back. We tried to take back islands that were considered that were important. So we kind of bypassed some, and there were actually some cases where we skipped some islands where they had Japanese on them, and they didn't know the war was over. This is a true story about this. And like even years later, like decades later, you had people that actually thought the war was still going on because they bypassed it. There's a lot of islands in the Pacific that are kind of uninhabited, about that. Now, they had different strategies. The Navy wanted to attack through the Central Pacific. This was the brainchild of Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was the head of the Pacific Navy of the American forces. And then Douglas MacArthur, who was the head of the Army forces in the Pacific, he wanted to attack through the Southern Pacific. So different routes. You can see in that map right here the routes that they took. So yeah, the Navy wants to go this way. Then MacArthur wanted to go this way because MacArthur wanted to take back the Philippines. That was one of his big things he wanted to do because at the beginning of the war in the Pacific, MacArthur had been on the Philippines and he had been forced out. And he made that famous statement, if you know about it, during World War II, where he said, "I shall return." They also had the Battle of Guadalcanal. That's really considered to be the first American conflict we really fight in on land against the Japanese. We fought to take back what is the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands were important because they were close to like New Guinea and Australia. In fact, at one point, the Japanese actually attacked Australia and bombed Darwin, which is in the northern part of Australia. And so it led to the Battle of Guadalcanal, which would last 6 months or so between August 42 to about February of 1943. It was, by the way, considered one of the first great battles that was fought by American Marine forces in World War II. It's mostly Marine battle. And it was called the Isle of Death, by the way, Guadalcanal, because the Japanese forces, who were about 36,000 strong, a lot of them refused to surrender because they were outnumbered heavily by American forces. And so eventually about that many were lost. And so what eventually happened was that they eventually abandoned the island, but the island was awful because of the jungle type warfare they were having to fight. You can see there from that quote right there on the bottom how bad it was. So just that's the kind of fighting they had to fight on some of these islands in the Pacific. It was just really that and excessive heat also on top of that. I don't have a picture of it. I'll kind of go back to the map, but they had other islands that they took as well in the Pacific. I don't know if you see what is Tara, which is right here. We also took that back as well in 1943. Yeah, Tara. Tara was a series of islands there, which are called the Gilbert Islands. We would take those as well. So we could have bases there to fight in the Pacific. That was taken back in November 1943. Mostly Marines, I think, were involved in that with some U.S. forces as well. But the key islands, which are really the most important that the Americans took in World War II, were the Mariana Islands, which are right here. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, all those were taken back in 1944. I believe the dates were mostly from, there's the islands right there, but they're mostly taken back predominantly, I think, in the summer of 1944, like June, July, August, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. And actually except 3 battles in a row: Guam, Tinian, Saipan. And why were the Mariana Islands important? Well, they're important because the fact that what happened afterwards, if you know about it, the United States then set up bomber bases there so that they could strike at Japan from the air. Because, you know, in Europe, the Americans, British, etc., were bombing, you know, Germany in the war. They thought that would be like a, you know, continuous Allied bombing campaign would help to end the war. And so the Americans brought up this new bomber that they built during the war. It was very, very famous, called the B-29 Super Fortress. They used those to bomb Japan with them. They also would drop atomic bombs on them with them as well. So those are strategic islands that were important, of course, in the war. The Americans did take the Philippines up. You know about MacArthur waded ashore in 1944. It's kind of controversial, Battle of the Philippines. We really didn't have to go in the Philippines. I think it ended up causing close to like 1 million casualties in the war, like a lot of civilian deaths and wounded, I know, during the war. But for some reason, I guess it was basically something MacArthur wanted to do. But it didn't really affect, I don't think, the outcome of the war as much as they thought it would. That was, by the way, a staged photograph that MacArthur did. Apparently, when they came ashore, they forgot to take a picture. So he went back and did a picture. It's just kind of funny about that. Now, they did have a very famous battle I did want to mention about that occurred right prior to when the Allies invaded the Philippines. They did have the battle of it's called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is about right here, east of the Philippines. Anyway, that was considered, I guess, one of the most strategic battles in the American forces taking the Philippines. And it was considered, by the way, to be one of the largest naval battles in modern history. Over 300 U.S. ships were involved in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I forget how many carriers we had in the battle, but it was some crazy amount, like 20 or more that we had, because we built a lot of carriers during the wars, fleet carriers and smaller carriers. And we practically wiped out the Japanese Navy. The Japanese didn't have any more carriers or anything to really fight us. They lost a lot of their main battleships as well. But if you know what happened at what is Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and all these other battles later, the Japanese began using kamikaze suicide planes, where they basically armed planes with bombs or whatever, explosives or fuel. They tried to basically destroy ships with them. And so they think that between 1944 to 45, you can see there that they at one point killed somewhere between that 9,000 something sailors were killed and wounded. And you can see they damaged or sunk a lot of ships. 368 were damaged or sunk. 34 were actually sunk outright, which is kind of amazing. And I think kamikaze meant divine wind is what it meant. And they thought it was like a super weapon that they could think that could turn the war around. But it really was just not possible. And I think the USS Kidd, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, you know, if you've ever visited, was actually hit by a kamikaze airplane, if you know about that, and damaged it. And you don't really see that now, but it was damaged during the war because of it. Now, I did want to talk about for a few minutes as well these other two battles that they had in World War II that were well known. They had the Battle of Iwo Jima that was fought between February to March of 1945. Of course, that was known as Operation Detachment. That was a very famous battle, especially for American U.S. Marines. So really their most famous battle that they ever had. And of course, it's, as you know, immortalized in the so-called Marine Corps hymn. They mention about the sands of Iwo Jima, which is a volcanic island. And why did they want Iwo Jima? What was the reason for it? Well, Iwo Jima was an actual island that was east of Japan, where they wanted to seize it as this kind of like a bomber base, but really as a base or close support for bombers that might be damaged. Like say you're flying over Japan, your B-29 gets hit or whatever, they could have a place to land on the way back, because flying back to the Marianas Islands is kind of a long way to go. So that's why they took it, basically. So it's called Operation Detachment. And the Marines suffered something like 26,000 men were killed and wounded in the battle. And the Japanese, who had a force of about, I think it was like 20,000 men or so, refused to surrender their forces, even though they were outnumbered by the American forces. Most of them fought to the death, like the last man. I think only 200 men actually surrendered. And the reason why is because the Japanese believed in this thing called the Code of Bushido, which is the old samurai code. You know about that in Japan. And the belief was you had to basically fight to the death. You know, your whole job as a soldier was to die for the emperor. That was the greatest thing, you know, to do. They'd make those banzai charges, you know, they banzai, banzai. They all kill themselves in battle, you know. But they thought that to surrender was a cowardly thing. So which is why they mistreat a lot of POWs in the war that surrendered, because they thought that was a cowardly thing to do, basically. Iwo Jima, by the way, is very famous for the so-called flag raising on Iwo Jima. You may have heard of, where 6 Marines actually raised the American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi, it's called, which was this dormant volcano that's on the island. And there was a photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal. That's kind of the iconic one that's on the right. You can see there. And six Marines actually raised the flag on it. And by the way, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, 3 of the 6 men were actually killed in the battle. That's well known. One of them was an Native American Indian named Ira Hayes, who was from, I think, Pima. He was a Pima Indian from Arizona. He was one of the most famous men that was involved in the flag raising. But he never was the same after Iwo Jima. He was a drunk after the war. I think died in his early 30s. Kind of a sad story. But a lot of these men, you know, went through a lot, you know, in these conflicts. It was brutal fighting, especially with the Japanese being tenacious and not wanting to surrender. Then you've got, of course, Okinawa, the Battle of Okinawa, really the last major battle that we really have in the war against the Japanese. What happened was between March to about June, about roughly when it is, the United States takes Okinawa, which is one of the Japanese home islands, which are kind of south of Japan. And the Americans were hoping to use Okinawa as a base to invade Japan, which they called it Operation Downfall. And they thought that when they invaded, it would be mass casualties, that the Japanese, you know, would try to fight to the death. And so luckily we had the atomic bomb that kind of shortened the war, which I'll get to later. But they called it Operation Iceberg, is what they called it. And it involved American forces and Marines. And Okinawa was, by the way, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. It was also the largest amphibious invasion that we had in the Pacific as well. We outnumbered them again. I think they had somewhere between, I don't forget how many troops they had exactly, but it was something like 120,000 or more. I think that the Japanese had. I think they also forced Okinawans to be conscripted to fight with them as well. So a lot of them died in the battle. And we suffered the most in the Pacific in that battle. Somewhere between 60 to 70,000 were killed or wounded or couldn't fight during that battle. I forget the exact number. There's kind of a debate about how many people were killed. I see all kinds of numbers about how many people were killed at Okinawa, but it was somewhere between 12 and 13,000 that were killed in Okinawa overall. Japanese, of course, a lot of them refused to surrender. They had to fight to the death with them again. You can see only about maybe 10% of their force actually surrendered at the end of the battle. So really bloody fighting. Of course, the kamikaze attacks kept coming, of course, as well at Okinawa. So those 2 battles, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, are probably the 2 bloodiest battles that we really fought in the Pacific. That and the Battle of the Philippines. Those 3 are really the bloodiest that we had, pretty much. All right, now the other thing that's famous about the end of World War II, as you know, they had the so-called atomic bomb, that would help to end World War II overall. And I'll kind of get into that as well, because that's kind of important into helping to shorten, World War II. We have the so-called Manhattan Project, which is developed under Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. That happened at the end of the war. From about 1943 to 45, the U.S. would start building this super weapon to help shorten the war, an atomic bomb. And the U.S. military was mostly involved in it. They were the ones that kind of helped develop the Manhattan Project. And it was, by the way, called Manhattan Project because some of the experiments were done in Manhattan, New York at Columbia University. So hence the name Manhattan being used. But project was done all over the place. I think in Chicago, they had some experiments done. University of Chicago, one of those, I think, universities as well. Tennessee, they did a lot of the refinement of the uranium, plutonium. And then, of course, in what is New Mexico is where they actually built the bombs themselves, which is Los Alamos. And the actual general that controlled the project, who ran it, was a famous U.S. Army Corps of Engineers general and also an engineer named Leslie Groves. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie called Fat Man and Little Boy. You ought to be able to see it. It's pretty good with Paul Newman in it. But it's kind of a good movie about that whole issue with Groves. And he basically ran the project. And Groves, by the way, was very famous during the war for building the Pentagon building. I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., but he's the one who built and designed the U.S. Defense Department's, main defense building, which is in a Pentagon shape, Pentagon, and that's kind of what he became famous for. It would kind of be worse, but I'll get to the hydrogen bomb later. But the hydrogen bomb is now the bombs they got now, which is like 1,000 times more powerful than the ones dropped at Hiroshima. So if they ever drop hydrogen bombs, we're all dead, pretty much. They'll burn the earth up. Most people don't know that. But anyway, so what happened was, if you know about what occurred, he hired this man named J. Robert Oppenheimer. You want to talk about, I think his first name was Julius, I think it was, but Oppenheimer was the main American physicist that actually designed the bombs. He was later known as the so-called father of the atomic bomb. That's a nice nickname to have. Oppenheimer was, by the way, an American physicist and professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Anyway, he built the bombs, designed them, and over time they would build 3 bombs. I don't know if you know this or not, but the first bomb they built was called the Gadget. That's what everybody called it, the Gadget. And it was a bomb that was designed at Alamogordo, New Mexico. And eventually, after they completed it in 1945, it was tested tested at Alamogordo, New Mexico. That's where they would blow it up. And it was part of a test called the Trinity test. When it was successful, when it blew up into like a big mushroom bomb, cloud that of course, these bombs are kind of known for, they realized that they now had this terror weapon that they could, help to end the war. And so Oppenheimer, I think, later remarked that he was the destroyer of worlds, that he's created this bomb that could literally blow up the world. And they had this other guy named Edward Teller, I think his name was later in the 1950s, would design the hydrogen bomb was even worse, which could, if they use those, will definitely blow up the world. They had different bombs built afterwards. The 2 big bombs they built later were Fat Man and, of course, Little Boy, which you may have heard of. The one on the front that's closer to the green one there, the smaller one, that one was, of course, a uranium bomb. And then the Fat Man one in the background, the yellow one, was a plutonium bomb. Both were, by the way, fission bombs using atomic matter. The hydrogen bomb is what they call a fusion bomb, which is a little different, which is more powerful, which is later. The bombs, by the way, were shipped across the Pacific. You know about this to Tianjin, where they were put on B-29s. and they basically used them to bomb Japan with them. And one of the first bombs, which is Little Boy, the parts for it were shipped on this ship called the USS Indianapolis, which was a fast cruiser. And if you know what happened after it delivered the bomb, it was sunk by a Japanese submarine, and majority of the men died. They either drowned or they got eaten by sharks. You may have heard the story about that. So it was very secretive operation, Manhattan Project. Very few people knew what they were actually building, which is why they call it the gadget, by the way. To kind of keep it secretive about what it was. Eventually, the first bomb was dropped by this plane called the Enola Gay, which is, there's kind of a picture of the Enola Gay. It was a very famous B-29, probably the most famous plane ever in World War II. It's in the Smithsonian, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. And it dropped the first bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. It was piloted by this man named Paul Tibbets, who I think I've got a picture of right here. Tibbets. Here's Tibbets and his crew right there. And they didn't know what they were going to do, by the way. I think Tibbets knew probably what was going on, but his crew didn't know until they were kind of like close to the target, basically. Always love the shorts, kind of short shorts there. But basically, I think the plane was named after his mother. He was called Enola Gay. That's since the name, of course, being used. The first bomb, of course, is one of the most famous, as you know. There's the so-called mushroom cloud, of course, from these atomic bombs blowing up. And the first bomb killed about close to, I want to say, 100,000 people that died. It wiped out several square miles of Hiroshima. It took years for Hiroshima to kind of make a comeback in Japan. And many people died of radiation poisoning from actual, the aftermath of the bombing. And then later they did have a second bomb. They dropped another bomb, which was the so-called Fat Man bomb I told you about. That was dropped on August 9th, 1945 on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. The so-called B-29 boxcar, I think was the one. It killed 80,000 or more people as well. So I think both bombs combined killed something like close to 200,000 people with these bombs. Here's some pictures, by the way, showing the aftermath of the bomb. Here's one in color. You can kind of get an idea that unless your building was made of cement or something like that, most of them were destroyed, buildings and so on. So several square miles were just totally wiped out. And most people didn't know much about what happened with these bombs being dropped until this guy named John Hersey went over there, who was a journalist. He published a bunch of articles that eventually became a book called Hiroshima. And so people kind of know now, about what happened. And so Japan was the only country that was ever, by the way, atomic bombed, if you know about this. And hopefully nobody ever has another nuclear bomb that's dropped on them, because it would obviously be pretty devastating. Japan, by the way, would eventually surrender its forces. If you know about it, August 15th, 1945, Japan would start surrendering to the Allies in the Pacific, parts of Asia, and this became known as Pacific in America. It was called Victory over Japan Day, or also VJ Day. That's what they actually nickname it later. Later, the actual Japanese do not surrender to the Allies until September 2nd, 1945. They surrendered on the ship called the USS Missouri, which was an American battleship in Tokyo Bay. So that's considered to be, they think, when World War II kind of came to an end officially. So World War II lasted 6 years total. 60 million people being killed, worldwide, they think, all across the world, from Europe to Asia, Pacific, etc. And so that's something that, was totally devastating for a lot of countries. It's part of why a lot of countries never really covered till later. Also why the Cold War happened, because, after the war, United States, Soviet Union were the only two, superpowers that were kind of left. After the war, if you know about it, the Allies also discovered atrocities that were committed of course, in World War II. Of course, Auschwitz, you can see there, all the people, embarked, and of course, later, some of those put to death, if you know that, by the Germans. And if you know about it during the war, they had the so-called Holocaust that happened, where, if you know about it, the Germans, Nazi Germany, committed a bunch of genocide against Jews and other peoples throughout Europe, Slavs, also Soviet citizens and soldiers as a whole. And it included, like, they were murdered through various pogroms that went back probably to like 1938, going back to Kristallnacht and all that. But also mass shootings that were done. They also forced a lot of Jews into ghettos, like in Poland. And then, as you know, the thing that the Germans started doing, especially from 1942 to about 44, they started this policy of extermination, where they forced a lot of Jews and other groups into concentration. And also, they executed people in death camps, like using gas chambers and things like that. And so they called it, the Germans had a nickname for it. They call it the final solution to the Jewish question. It was something that they started really discussing in January of 1942 at this conference outside of Berlin called the Wannsee Conference. And so the SS, they think guided by Hitler, devised a plan to kind of round up Jews all throughout Europe and then basically ship them to Poland, where they would be worked to death as slaves or obviously exterminated, which a lot of them were. And these are the famous, supposedly the big extermination camps that were big. Auschwitz-Birkenau was, of course, supposedly one of the most famous, which you see there, the disembarkment right there, where they were shipped by trains on cattle cars. Belzec, Chelmno, Matadek, Sobibor, Treblinka, those were all famous, where maybe an estimated 6 million Jews may have perished in the Holocaust. This is going back to probably the beginning of the war and all that. But you can see the where they were shipped from. That France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany. Also later in the war, they shipped a bunch of them from Hungary, if you know about that, and even from Greece. They had Jews in Greece. They were shipped also to basically Poland, were killed eventually later. And a lot of this was discovered during the war. At the end of the war, I think that when the Soviets invaded into Poland, and also the Americans discovered a lot of the concentration camps like Dachau, Dachau and all that, in Germany and all that, of course, which is kind of famous. Let me talk about a few more things, and that's pretty much it. But yeah, they do think that an estimated 11 million people may have died, by the way, under Nazi Germany. So these are all the people that the Germans at one point killed: Poles, Soviet civilians, and prisoners of war. I think 3 to 4 million POWs that were under the Soviets died under German custody. It's amazing. The Roman, what you call gypsies, handicapped, political, religious dissents, and they think about so many thousand gays or homosexuals were actually put to death as well. So they went after all kinds of peoples. Almost half that were Jews, they think, overall. Now, they also have this thing you may have heard of called the Nuremberg trials, which were held after World War II ended. That was basically where there were a series of these war crime trials, military tribunals, as they called them. They were held in Bavaria, southern Germany. They picked Nuremberg because that's where the Nazis used to have all their big rallies and all that. And they put all kinds of prominent Nazi people on basically on trial through military judges for war crimes, etc. And you can see there on the left, which is right here, the most famous who was at the trial was Hermann Goering, who was head of the Luftwaffe, but he got in trouble because he used slave labor during the war. And so he was later seen as a war criminal and was found guilty at the end of the war. They hung about 10 Germans, by the way, after the war. They were high-ranking Nazis, and a bunch of others were actually in prison, like Albert Speer and Rudolf Hess and a few others. And so, yeah, that's basically some of the things. And they did the same thing in Japan. Like the Hideki Tojo, if you know about it, was put on trial later. And I think he was executed after the war as well. So a lot of the Allies, had some of these Axis powers, people, heads of state or whatever, eventually were basically executed, after the war for that or imprisoned. Now, I'm going to get to it later, probably later in the week on Thursday, but I'll kind of talk about the next thing. We'll talk about the Cold War era. The Cold War era is going to be the thing that's going to come next from the 1940s up to the 1990s. And, of course, I'll get to that later. It's this geopolitical struggle that happens between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's a major issue which, almost causes World War III to break out. Yeah, they both sides had hydrogen bombs. So can you imagine we would have used that, during that period, we might have had World War III. It's still possible that it could happen because we're not exactly friendly with Russia and China like we should be. That's one thing you have to look at today. It's like we're almost in another Cold War again, I think. But I'll talk about that later. Of course, I said, later on Thursday about that. So I'll have one more lecture coming up for the semester for this class. So if anybody has any questions, of course, about this lecture or previous lectures, let me know later through my channel. I think we already had like a couple of questions like today. I think we had already. But that's it for today. I hope y'all have a great rest of the week. But remember, we have some assignments that are basically out there still. Don't forget about them. They got that World War I quiz y'all need to wrap up on. The Veterans Project, I think I told you, due Saturday, May 1st. Then vocabulary is due next week, the final one starting Monday. So that's it for today. I will see you, of course, later, like I said, on Thursday. So y'all take care. I'll see you later.